one of the advantages of having your previous files already edited is that you can start swapping out stuff and you can slowly see your end result of your video coming in. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about the editing process here in Blender and some of the tricks that I use to spruce up the final movie just a bit with some extra elements that you can add in. So the first thing I want to talk about very quickly is with all my final renders, once you start editing them together, you'll start noticing that even though during compositing you try to get the colors as close as possible, you're still going to have to do a little bit of color correction. Now, the really nice thing about Blender's editor is you can add these little adjustment layers. If you hit Shift A and you go to Effect Strip, there's an adjustment layer. And if you click that on that adjustment layer and we look down here, you have these modifiers that you can add. So I added curves modifiers to some of these shots to bring them together and to make sure that it looked sort of consistent. This is a really quick way of working, and if you're used to other editing software, it's quite similar to some of the more commercial options out there. Now, I really like using Blender's editor. It's fairly quick, even pulling all these files from the network drive that I'm using right now. And it's good to have all these options available. Now, the second thing that you can do as well is, this is a really nice example for this shot, is I have a little transform effect strip over here. So if we go down to effect strip, you can add transform. The reason I use this over here is because I wanted to flip my original image. Now, sometimes it can really help when you're editing just to flip stuff around, flip it upside down, flip it from left to right and see what happens. Sometimes it gives you a more dynamic shot, and the reason I did it is, let's say I flip it over here, we have a camera movement that's going sort of from left to right, and then the next shot we have a camera movement going from left to right again. I found that to be a little boring and a little repetitive, so I just flipped over this image, and there we go. We have something that works quite well and is a little more dynamic. Now, the last thing that I tend to add in editing are these little color flashes that you see at the end. And, you know, if you've looked at the end result and you're wondering why I haven't talked about these yet, and that's because basically I didn't do these in 3D. I just grabbed my camera, I grabbed my phone and a bottle of water, and I just sort of held the bottle of water in front of the camera with the lens taken off it and messed around, and all these little reflections and things you see is basically just the light of the phone under it reflecting inside the bottle of water. Now, I could have probably done this in 3D with some simulation or some other stuff or particles or whatever, but it takes a really long time, and something that I find works really well is that sort of these flashes, because they're done in an analog way, with real life camera movement and camera tricks, they feel a lot more natural, and they can really add that little extra element of sort of natural feeling to your final edit. Now, as you can see, this is not a very complex edit. I kept it fairly simple, mainly because I wanted to get the project done in time so I could start recording these tutorials. But Blender's editor is working very well, and you know, I had a really good time creating this project and exploring some of the capabilities that it has. Now, there are other alternatives, especially on Linux, that you could use, like Kdenlive or OpenShot, and I actually started this project in Kdenlive, but I ended up moving over to the Blender editor because I found it to be a little bit faster. Now, something that's very important is if we go into the user preferences, down here we have a sequencer/clip editor memory cache limit. Now, I've got 64 gigabytes of RAM in my machine, so I can set this to the maximum of 32 gigabytes. But something that's really important to remember is if you have, let's say, 8 gigabytes of RAM in your machine or 16, don't set it to the maximum. You know, if Blender fills up all the memory, will start getting really slow and might start crashing, and we definitely want to avoid that. That being said, the higher you can set this, the more Blender can cache into RAM, and the quicker your sequencer will play the second time you play it. So you can get near real-time performance off a network drive with really large files like I do. And I know if I put them on like an SSD or whatever, an internal drive on my computer, it'll probably play just fine. Now, another last thing is that once you've edited these all together, you can actually use Blender's exporter as well just fine. So setting it to H.264 is what I used for the final edit. And this is a good format to send previews with, or to send over the web to other people. But you could set this to lossless, for example. I don't know where it is. It's over here somewhere. Oh no, here it is, lossless output. I was looking completely next to it, of course. Setting this to lossless output will give you a really nice file to sort of master file to make any derivatives from. So let's say you're doing stuff for YouTube and Vimeo, you can have separate exports from that master file, and you could use an external program like Handbrake for that. So that basically concludes the workflow portion of the videos. I hope you enjoyed a bit of a behind the scenes on how I created this, and obviously if you have questions you can always ask them. I'll be happy to answer. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this series, and if you haven't checked out the technique videos yet, definitely do so. There's some interesting stuff in there as well. And thank you very much for watching, and yeah, I'll talk to you maybe at the Blender conference or whatever. Okay, that was it for me. Goodbye.